Ever since it debuted in 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre has been a staple of the horror genre, with its antagonist Leatherface becoming one of the most recognisable characters in cinema. The film had a profound effect on general audiences and the media, who found themselves both repulsed yet fascinated by its hyper-violent nature and gritty attention to detail. Many gave the film scathing reviews for these exact reasons. However, despite what general audiences or the media thought of it back then, you can't deny that it is one of the most significant films to come out in recent years, with many even still discussing it to this very day. In this analysis, I hope to give some insight into why I personally hold the film in extremely high regard, with it being one of my favourite films, not just in the context of horror, but one of my favourite films ever made. Also, a quick word of warning. We are going to be discussing big spoilers for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In fact, not even just Fuck, I can't even speak English. Not only are we going to be discussing spoilers, by spoilers I mean I'm basically just gonna do a rundown of the entire film. So if you haven't seen Texas Chainsaw before and you want to see it, then I suggest you turn off the video now and go and watch it, and then come back. And if you don't come back, well then I'm going to find out where you live and I'm going to burn your fucking house down.
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths, in particular Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother Franklin. It is all the more tragic in that they were young, but had they lived very, very long lives, they could not have expected, nor would they have wished to see as much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare. The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released right at the tail end of US involvement in the Vietnam War. America was hurt, and cinema reflected that very well. Taxi Driver told the story of a broken veteran, disenfranchised with the world around him. The Deer Hunter explored the American psyche, going into, enduring, and leaving the conflict behind. With the decline of the motion picture production code in the mid to late 60s, it gave filmmakers many more opportunities to explore topics like these. This liberal attitude to filmmaking gave us some of the most culturally significant films of the 20th century, including The Exorcist and, in particular, The Godfather. Texas Chainsaw reflects this well, acting as an important period piece that displayed the drastic change in cinema. With all that taken into account, we must then turn to the man of the hour, Tobe Hooper. Or is it Tobe Hooper? Look, I don't give a shit. He had a great interest in films from a young age, and this all came to a head in the 1960s when Hooper made his 2 very first films, The Heisters and Eggshells. Neither of these films were box office darlings, but they did receive praise from publications such as the Austin Chronicle. Hooper's breakout success was of course the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, raking in over $30 million, which is equivalent to $150 million nowadays. Hooper is a very diverse director, and each one of his films have a distinct theme and tone, be it comedy, horror, or even leaning more towards science fiction. However, of the Hooper films I've seen, none have had quite as big of an effect on me as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is where we start talking about the film now. Texas Chainsaw follows 5 characters as they cruise through the Texas backwater. Sally, her brother Franklin, Kirk, Jerry and Pam. A recent spree of grave robbings has arisen in this humble part of, well, the middle of fucking nowhere, to be honest. Sally is ensuring her grandfather's grave hasn't fallen victim to these robbings. Once the gang is on the road again, they happen to come across a hitchhiker in the road and pick him up. To say this guy is a little unhinged would be an understatement. He comes across as a very broken character, along with the fact that he's a hitchhiker, a motif throughout film to portray a character who's lost. The Vietnam connotations are quite evident. The hitchhiker becomes fascinated by Franklin's knife and uses it to slice his hand open. At this point I say cut your losses and kick the fucker out of the van, but they decide to just gloss over it. Okay. After the hitchhiker's outburst, he takes a photo of Franklin and tries to make him pay for it. Franklin of course turns him down and the hitchhiker proceeds to burn the photo with a pile of gunpowder. Everyone in the van starts to panic and this only worsens once the hitchhiker grabs Franklin's arm and slices it open. He's promptly kicked out of the van. Later, they stop by a petrol station to refuel the van, but the tanks are empty. The old petrol station attendant recommends that they hang around until the morning. But no, they decide to press on to Sally's old house. The characters then split up to explore the countryside a bit, with Kirk and Pam sneaking off together. They eventually come across an old dilapidated house, and Kirk ventures inside. From here, he begins to hear pig squeals in the background, and goes to check it out.
Hello!
The sheer sudden impact, combined with Kirk's violent spasms on the ground, really caught me off guard. It was bad enough watching this as a young fella, but even coming back to it all these years later, it's still just as horrible as I remember. And the most surprising aspect of it is that it manages to achieve all of this without any explicit imagery. No brains, a minuscule amount of blood, and it's very effective without needing to disgust the viewer. To top it all off, the low synth hum as Leatherface throws the door closed behind him is extremely eerie, as though it's a door to hell itself. The skulls and the red wallpaper certainly reinforce this idea. Pretty spooky. Pam goes to explore the house by herself, blissfully unaware of what's happened to Kirk. After stumbling across Leatherface's charming decor, what the fuck do you call this? She then tries to escape the house. This image right here is probably the scariest in the whole film, in my opinion. Gunnar Hansen, the actor portraying Leatherface, is an absolute giant. The idea that he can carry someone away with such ease is absolutely panic-inducing. He has this almost omnipotent presence too, where he can appear from practically anywhere and turn you into a human pincushion. Oh, speaking of which... if there's one thing that deeply unsettles me in films, it's when women are violently attacked. There are, of course, good ways and bad ways to go about this. Needlessly harming women and making a spectacle out of it for the sake of controversy is, well, needless. However, Texas Chainsaw uses this to great effect, as the whole story revolves around a group of unsuspecting teens being butchered. Is it awful? Well, yeah, but it's a fucking horror film. It's to be expected. After all that chaos comes to a close, Jerry decides to go exploring the area and happens to come across the same house that Pam and Kirk did. As Jerry wanders through the house, he finally makes his way to the kitchen. And upon opening the freezer, he's greeted by... Jesus fucking Christ. That scares the shit out of me every time. This is what I mean. If you refer back to the title of the video, I've titled this analysis Sensory Overload, because that's exactly what Texas Chainsaw does. It creates an atmosphere of suspense and dread, slowly building and building, until the mid to late act, when all hell breaks loose as these characters are violently murdered one by one. Unlike many other horror films, they don't feel the need to bombard you with flashy jump scares and loud noises. Instead, just the act of Pam's sudden post-mortem jolt and the scream of Jerry as his skull is smashed by Leatherface is all you need. This is real human emotion. This is horror. And on top of that, Gunnar Hansen again completely dominates the screen when he comes in and murders Jerry. He's an absolute giant of a man, and seeing him crash down on Jerry with such force really gets the gritty atmosphere going. Shortly after Jerry's demise, Sally and Franklin begin to get worried. Night has fallen fairly quickly and they decide to venture off in search of their friends. While exploring the woods again, they begin to become anxious that again, the film manages to get a jump out of the viewer, and it goes back to my point of Leatherface being this almost omnipotent being who can appear just about anywhere. With the death of her brother Franklin, Sally runs into the forest in an attempt to escape the crazed killer, and happens to come across the same petrol station they pulled into hours earlier. The attendant rushes Sally in and sits her down. Upon exiting the shop, Sally has time to get her bearings, and takes notice of the meat cooking in the barbecue. Once the attendant returns, he's seen holding a bag and a rope. Sally naturally understands what's going on and picks up a knife. She then... Are you fucking serious? Anyway, he slaps the knife away from her and puts her into a bag. After a lengthy drive, she is tied to a dining chair and happens to come across an old friend.
I thought you was in a hurry.
This entire dinner section here is the embodiment of sensory overload. As Sally is forced to sit at the table, she passes out, only to wake up later and realise... she's been tied to the dining room chair with a pair of disembodied hands wrapped around her. And as she begins screaming in anguish, the family howls along with her. It gets worse and worse by the second, with the close-ups of Sally's face and the metallic scraping all around. This all culminates with old fucking Yankee Doodle Dandy here, smacking Sally over the head with a hammer. This again taps into the discomfort from seeing Pam get put on the meat hook. I just really don't like seeing this. I mean, when you really get down to it, we're literally watching some frail, mentally broken woman be smacked over the head with a hammer. It's an agonising scene to watch, but it keeps the horror going. Thankfully, Sally manages to escape the Craze family and burst through the window landing into the front of the house. Sally wastes no time in getting to her feet and running from the house as fast as she can. The hitchhiker in Leatherface follows suit and chase her. The hitchhiker catches up and begins to slash at her back before he gets a little more acquainted with this truck's tyre. Leatherface then bursts onto the scene and begins chasing the trucker and Sally. After getting a well-deserved wrench to the forehead and a chainsaw to the leg, Leatherface quickly gets up and limps to Sally before she can get away. But it's too late. Sally hops into the pickup truck and we are left with one of the most infamous endings in cinema history. With that, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes to a close, leaving an impression on both cinema and myself. I'll call back to what I said earlier, that being that Texas Chainsaw is one of my favourite films ever made. And the reason behind this is that Texas Chainsaw gave me one of the most intimate looks into bodily harm and psychological terror ever. It may start off as a slow burn, but from the mid to late section, it's an absolute nightmare that holds your hand and doesn't let go. As well as the acting and set design, the film also has masterful cinematography, with shots such as the bodies in the opening and the sunset backdrop as Leatherface flails his chainsaw being some of my favourites. Over the years, many scholars and journalists have tried to analyse the film and make sense of some of the deeper underlying messages of it. Many to this day still think of Texas Chainsaw as any other basic slasher film. However, I beg to differ. It's clear to see that the Sawyer family, that being the Craze family from the film, were victims of industrial capitalism. Around the 1970s, when Texas Chainsaw was released, the economy had taken a nosedive due to the effects of the Vietnam War. And rural America had really suffered because of this. The Sawyer family clearly had a heavy involvement in the slaughterhouse business, judging by the many animal skulls seen in the film and what the younger Sawyer brother had to say about working there. It's well established that the Sawyer family are cannibals, and this may be a commentary on how rural America suffered because much of the business flowing into the country had hinged on the big cities, and, as a result, many outside that environment suffered. All in all, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a great horror film. Definitely not for everyone. As far as grindhouse and exploitation films go, it's fairly rough. But for those of you out there looking for a constant anxiety attack of a film, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a masterpiece in every sense of the word. But with all that said and done, I'd like to thank everyone who tuned into this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. As the weeks go on, I'm hoping to cover more horror films and games during the month of Halloween. No guarantees, especially seeing as my first semester of college is in full swing now, but At the very least, I'm going to try and make an effort to ensure that you get your fill of videos. So until then, take it easy.